back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at the conservative movement in the 1980s. Some of the key objectives we'll be looking at the differences between liberal and conservative viewpoints. We'll analyze the causes behind the conservative resurgence in the early 1980s. And we'll see why Ronald Reagan won the presidency in 1980. Question 1. Why was 1964 one of the lowest points for the conservative movement? 1964 was a difficult nominating convention for the Republicans. They nominated one of the most conservative candidates in the history of the Republican Party. And with Goldwater representing true conservatism and kind of a really a right-wing kind of approach towards government, he was soundly defeated by one of the more liberal, certainly from a social welfare program standpoint, in Lyndon Johnson. Johnson stomped Goldwater, winning an overwhelming victory. In addition to that, Republicans lost seats in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, indicating that the country pretty much rejected conservatism entirely in the 1964 election. Two, how did Goldwater and Republicans react to their losses in 1964? Barry Goldwater, he returned to Arizona, which is his home state. As he returned to Arizona, he resumed his position as a senator from Arizona and continued to be a champion, one of the strong conservative voices in America. And a new conservative leader of the Republican Party emerged during this period of time. He gave a very powerful speech at the 1964 nominating convention in support of Barry Goldwater conservatism, Ronald W. Reagan, Ronald Wilson Reagan. He took the conservative mantle from Goldwater, winning the governorship in 1966 on a conservative platform. Having a conservative governor of California seems almost like an impossibility today in a modern California, as California really is not really embraced the Republican Party for generations. 3, the difference between liberal and conservative viewpoints in the 1980s, kind of compare and contrast here, include information about their economic views, foreign policy, values associated with each viewpoint. All right, so looking at 3 liberal economic views, they favor social programs to solve issues within society, and they look at a problem, they believe it's the government's responsibility to take care of all citizens. They also believe in the government regulation of industry, not allowing for businesses to get too powerful. Conservative economic views, they favor lower taxes and decreased regulation. Liberals on foreign policy, they favor participation with the United Nations, going to the UN for permission to act in the best interest of the United States, and diplomacy in an approach towards communism. A conservative foreign policy wanted increased national defense spending and to actively fight communism in the 1980s. Liberal values, they wanted to help the needy, and they felt that it was the responsibility of all citizens to pitch in to help out the less fortunate. Conservatives feared the loss of traditional values, in particular the decline of religion. You see the 2 images here, they're kind of beating each other up in the 1980s, and they still do so in contemporary times. Two animals tend to represent the respective political parties, as do the colors. So Democrats tend to be the blue, blue equals Democrats, red equals Republicans. The donkey on the left representing Democrats, and the elephant on the right representing the Republican Party. Question 4. What were the 3 legs of modern conservatism? Explain each of the main arguments. The free market economy, conservatives felt the government intervention in social programs led to waste, inflation, and rising debt. Secondly, strong religious and moral values, opposing the counterculture and the fear that traditional values could be wiped out as a result of the counterculture. And finally, a strong military. They opposed even their own Republican, Richard Nixon's détente, which was the lessening of tensions. They were strongly anti-communist, and they wanted to increase American military might and strength. Ronald Reagan would run on a lot of what we just mentioned here. 5, how are the views of conservatives in the 1980s similar to Nixon views, and how did the conservative views evolve from Nixon to Reagan? And I kind of foreshadowed or spoiled a little bit one of the responses. New federalism, Nixon wanted to give states more power while reducing the power of the federal government. Both believed in the silent majority of American citizens who agree with conservative views. Nixon favored détente, while Reagan characterized the Soviet Union as the evil empire and wanted to destroy communism. Emphasize this here. Nixon, he had pro-environmental policies, and in most cases, Republicans really don't favor too much in the way of protecting the environment. These are generalizations, nothing specific to all conservatives, and that's true for the Democrats as well. We mentioned some of these generalities. This is kind of an overview of the respective political parties and their views, but nothing that's definitive for any one individual. You may be liberal or conservative and have different views than the liberal or conservatives would advocate here. 6, how do the Republican and Democratic parties blend together during the 40s and 50s? Both parties had adopted a hardline foreign policy during the Cold War that emphasized the policy of containment to stop the spread of communism. Well, if you remember during the Red Scare during the 40s and 50s, obviously if you were someone who was wishy-washy in communism, you could kind of get swept away in sort of that Red Scare, anti-communist fever. Truman was president through the end of 1952. Eisenhower took over on January 20th, 1953. Truman's a Democrat, Eisenhower's a Republican, but they had very similar positions, anti-communist, containment, the domino theory, this whole idea that they were fearful of the spread of communism. Seven, explain the new right. And remember, right and conservatism, and Republicans are synonymous, left, Democrats, liberals, synonymous. The new right under Reagan's leadership would be a coalition. It means different groups within the auspices of the Republican Party. Republican candidates elected, which included foreign policy hawks who viewed communism and the Soviet Union as evil, fiscal conservatives who wanted to shrink the size of the government and cut social welfare programs. Social conservatives were deeply religious, were pro-life, pro-guns, and these remain core, positions within the Republican Party even in contemporary times. 8, what events in the 1960s and 70s led to a decline in public's faith in the federal government? Well, obviously, Watergate under Richard Nixon was a disturbing period of time in American history, and one of which really put a stain on the American presidency and certainly on the Republican Party, eroding the public faith in the government. You combine that with the Vietnam War, but there's a lot of misinformation or disinformation on how well things were going and how long we got stuck in Vietnam. So confidence in general in the office of the presidency was on the decline in the late 60s and 70s. Stagflation, which was a recession that damaged American optimism. Optimistic Americans were, hopeful that things would change, but really the conditions in the country were quite poor, especially during the later 1970s in the Carter administration. Many historians argue that Johnson's Great Society plan helped to create inflation and was ultimately not entirely successful. 9, why do many people believe the Great Society programs did not work? Stagflation had troubled the economy during the 1970s, and many people blamed these new programs. Others believed that welfare encouraged people not to work, rewarding women for having additional children, who then, if they had children out of wedlock, will receive additional aid and financial help from the government. Others believed affirmative action programs, such as busing and employment programs, went too far, and some even argued created reverse discrimination. Who started the moral majority. The Reverend Jerry Falwell started the Moral Majority. It was an organization of conservative ministers. They worked collectively towards the goal of getting Republicans elected to office, in particular, focused in on Ronald Reagan in the 1980 presidential election. In the lead up to the 1980 election, allegedly the Moral Majority motivated 2 million new voters to come out and vote, mostly for the Reagan-Bush ticket. What was the difference between Jerry Falwell's moral majority and Nixon's silent majority? Nixon's silent majority focused on the many people who did not believe in big government, while Falwell's moral majority focused more on religious values, preserving traditional family units. Both were ways for conservatives to express their belief that many people quietly agreed with their ideals. What migration trends, political events, and demographic patterns contributed to the rise of the Republican Party in the 1980s? Many white Southerners became Republicans because of the civil rights advances in the 1960s. Additionally, more people moved to the Sun Belt and to the suburbs, which obviously had more votes than there for the Republicans. These areas were likely leaning towards Republican and kind of hardened their stance on Republicans in future elections. 13, why was Ronald Reagan able to succeed at winning the presidency while Barry Goldwater was not? Reagan was much more charismatic than Goldwater. He was a better communicator. Reagan, of course, a former actor, and so he had a good presence in front of the camera. Also, he had better timing. He ran for president after Jimmy Carter's presidency had began to wane, and while the Republican revival was on the upswing, so it was good timing for Reagan. Let's look at the background of Reagan here and some of his experiences, one of which I alluded to already. You see a younger Ronald Reagan picture here. He grew up in Illinois. He was first a sports broadcaster, gained stardom as a successful actor, rose up to be the president of the Screen Actors Guild, which is basically the union for actors and actresses. He became the governor of California in 1966, and he narrowly lost in 1976 the Republican nomination for the presidency. He challenged Gerald Ford and nearly defeated Ford for the nomination. 15, explain the key components of President Reagan's vision and ideas for the country and for conservatism. He believed in patriotism. He believed in self-reliance and cutting back on government assistance, meaning that citizens should rely on themselves instead of the government. An emphasis on moral values, religion. He wanted to cut taxes for all citizens. He wanted to build up the American military. Okay, 16, list of problems that President Carter and the nation were dealing with in 1980 as voters were contemplating who to vote for. Well, we were stuck in the Iranian hostage crisis. This was over 440 days into it. By the time voters went to the voting booth, Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. The United States, in response, boycotted the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow as a means of showing our displeasure for their invasion of Afghanistan. We had a weak economy during this period of time. We had very high interest rates, which made it very difficult to buy a home. 17, what question did Ronald Reagan ask Americans as he ran for president in 1980, which turned out to be an interesting question. He said, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Most Americans answered no. This theme is a major part of his victorious campaign, and he and Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush were elected to the presidency and vice presidency, respectively, in 1980. See the two pictured above. You have Reagan and Bush, Reagan and Bush. Or the final results of the 1980 election. Reagan won an overwhelming victory, 489 electoral votes to 49. Republicans regained control of the Senate for the first time since 1955, while the Democrats retained control of the House of Reps. If you look at the states won by Jimmy Carter, not much in the way of states there. Minnesota, West Virginia, Georgia, Washington, D.C. Ironically enough, West Virginia is one of the more recently strongly Republican states, so that one's kind of flipped in its entirety since the Carter presidency here. Also, Georgia is the home state of Carter, so not that unusual that he won the state of Georgia. His vice president was Walter Mondale, that was from Minnesota. So in reality, two of the three states that he won were basically the home states of the presidential candidate and vice presidential running mate Walter Mondale, respectively. And lastly, the lesson reflection. How do you think religious, social, and cultural issues should impact modern politics? What issues are most important to you? Well, I can't answer the last question, but we can certainly take a look at some of these issues here. Social and cultural issues should be an individual's choice, not necessarily imposed on them by the government. Issues like abortion and same-sex marriage should be considered settled issues and really should not see any further court challenges. I can't predict whether or not that will turn out to be true. Just my 2 cents. That'll conclude our discussion of the election here, the lead up to Ronald Reagan's 1980 victory. Until next time, when we look at the Reagan presidency in more detail, Mr. Clarke is out.